Hani de Toit. Hani is a professional speaker, a trainer, inclusion specialist, a conversational intelligence coach, a published author. Hani de Toit holds a qualification from UCT, Cambridge University, and as well as the World Business Executive Coaches. She graduated as a conventional intelligence coach in New York City under Dr. Judith E. Glazer, founder of the Creating We Institute. She also works closely with highly acclaimed international business gurus, Mike Hancock from New Zealand and South Africa, homecoming Landy Jack. Hani is the president of the Professional Speakers Association, Southern Africa, Western Cape, a Commencer registered coach and a volunteer lecturer in leadership and self-development at SIBA Education, South Africa only crowd-funded university. That's an amazing university. A children's book, Just Like Me, has been identified by Wits University as a model for writing about inclusion for children and has been translated into Urdu, a literacy organization in Pakistan. The book echoes her belief that if we look through a lens of compassion, we discover our shared humanity. With 24 years experience, she's not young, in training and development, Hani works locally and abroad with people of diverse nationalities and cultures within corporates, universities and government. As an inclusion specialist, she travels widely through Africa, Asia, Europe and the Middle East, learning about different cultures, customs and organizational practices, and identifies strategies for addressing the common struggles of human beings. Through this broad experience and rich expertise, she helps organizational leaders listen to the answers around them and co-create a culture of connection, shifting the language and the practices that breed under the performance, low morale, and negativity. Can we put our hands together as we welcome Hani to come and speak?
Thank you very much, Sawan, for that introduction. It was lovely listening to some of your reasons for being here and some of your joyous moments for the day. So thank you for sharing that. I agree with what Selwyn says. We haven't arrived until we've heard every voice. And so I do want to encourage you, when there are opportunities to share in your groups, to do so. I'm also going to ask, because the chairs are arranged in circles, that's important, but can I just ask that I don't have anybody's back to me? So the one or two people who have their backs, just turn your chair slightly so that you're facing the front, because the images I've selected for the presentation are images that I'm hoping are going to reinforce the message. But yes, we've just come out of a horrific 2 weeks, which has highlighted for us that this is not just a hot topic, but a necessary conversation that we need to have. And I'm sure that you would like to go home with some answers. Unfortunately, it's not one of those topics where you come somewhere and you get the right package and the answer's there and it's like a silver bullet and it's just the obvious solution. I don't think any of us as human beings have discovered what that is yet, or we would not have the number of wars happening at the moment around the world, aside from the kinds of wars happening in our communities, and sadly sometimes in our households. So we do need to be willing to ask, and this is really the point of the talk, is we need to be willing to ask different questions. So firstly, I'm going to tell you that my talk is structured in 3 parts. And it's structured in 3 parts because, 1, I'm not a linear thinker. I tend to join dots. You're in education, so I'm hoping that you're going to be willing to bear patiently with me for the kind of learner and speaker that I am. So what that means is I'm going to spend the first part of my talk telling you a little bit about neuroscience. Because you've heard with the Creating We Institute, my speciality is in the neuroscience of conversation, but I'll tell you more about that later. The second part of my talk is a little bit of a walk down memory lane while I share with you a very personal experience of becoming aware of my own prejudice. And this really is the starting point for each and every one of us when we want to engage in conversations around diversity. And then the third part of my talk is looking then at what are the practices for embracing diversity and also inviting inclusion. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about noticing that we're different. That's obvious. Right? We don't have to have discussions about how we're different. But it is about how do we maintain an inclusive culture? How do we co-create an inclusive culture in every circle where we are so that everybody experiences that they are seen, that they are heard, that they are safe, that they belong. That's ultimately what a culture of inclusion, which leads to a culture of connection, is about. So I'm feeling a bit stuck behind this mic. Can I walk around or do I take the mic with me? Okay, which means like that. Not rocket science. Okay, so we said earlier on that we all have an understanding of what diversity is. We knew why we're here. I just want you very quickly, because it's such a buzzword, to tell me, what do you think it means? Let me just go back. What's your idea of what diversity means? And I'll take shout outs. So the kind of pop that Selwyn was saying earlier on. Diversity, what's the first thing you think of? Differences. What else? Similarities, commonalities. Anything else? Color. Okay, and by color you mean race, you mean skin tone. Okay, anything else that comes up? I heard somebody speaking about being in a school where there's so many different cultures. Yes, so we can talk about culture. Religion. Anything else? Values. Very important, yes? Gender, language, faith. Others?
Melting pot.
Melting pot. Interesting word, right? Because this is the question of, do we have to give up who we are in order to coexist or be in an inclusive environment? Do we need to give up some of who we are? Do we all need to become the same? And maybe when people hear the title of my book, Just Like Me, they think that's what I'm advocating. Let's all become the same. But that would be impossible, and it wouldn't necessarily be constructive. It's not a solution. But it is an interesting point, because that's where we started when we started creating solutions for South Africa. So let's go into, obviously our favorite answers are usually with Professor Google. And what does Google say about diversity? It means understanding that each individual is unique. Yes, we all agree, isn't it? We're each wanting to be unique, and we want our uniqueness to be recognized and validated. And we want to recognize our individual differences. These can be along the dimensions of race, ethnicity, gender, all the things you mentioned here, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. We heard some people say, sorry, I can't shop at Woolworths. True. Age, physical abilities, religious beliefs, political beliefs, and any other ideologies. All of this is what diversity is about. It's also about different communication styles. I'm a fast speaker, you may have noted. Some people speak slowly. Some people are aggressive. Some people are passive aggressive. Yes, communication styles, that's also about diversity. Thinking patterns, learning styles. Yes, are you a kinesthetic learner? Are you a visual learner? Are you an auditory learner? All of these things are also what diversity is about. So we need to ask ourselves, when we're talking about this, this is such a big thing that we're talking about. How do we make headway? So I'm going to switch tracks now and ask you a different question. Maybe something that's seemingly unrelated. I'm going to start by asking you a question. What do you think the number one priority of your brain function is? Again, pop moment. Sorry? To breathe. Survival. What else? To keep me alive. How? By regulating your organs, all those things. Yeah, what else? To process information, thoughts, data. Anything else? To learn. Others?
To keep me safe.
Very, very good, to keep me safe. Now, it took me 24 years in education and development to really get clear. Thank you, sir, Mr. Tony Marshall, the first person I spoke to when I arrived. Actually, the second person. So it took me studying neuroscience to really get to primarily, the function of the brain is to keep me safe. So much so that the amygdala, sitting in the brain, also known as your reptilian brain, your lizard brain. None of us thought we were living with a lizard inside us. But actually, it can override all your other brain function. In other words, it's so primed and designed for your survival, for your protection, for your safety, that should a threat come into your space, your decision making, your reasoning, all your executive thinking goes out the window. And you are flooded with adrenaline, with cortisol, with testosterone. You have all the aggression needed to defend yourself or to run like hell. But we don't often speak about the 4 different responses to these fears and threats. It's not just fight or flight. There's also freeze or appease. So those people pleasers, it's a survival mechanism you're using to be able to stay safe by saying, yes, sir, ja, boss, sê maar so. And we don't mean it, right? We're just keeping ourselves safe. So why does the brain do this? I just want you to think about all the data that your brain is receiving in every given second. I want you to consider what I mean when I say all the data. You all had food. You saw the food. There were lots of different colors. When I came in, I could smell burnt coffee. I don't know about you. It smelled like terribly burnt coffee to me. And then there's the smells of the sauces on the foods, isn't it? If you're at the juice counter, it's a different smell. It's all data your brain's receiving while taking in the temperature of the room, the lighting in the room, discerning the number of faces, who's different, who's familiar, who do I know, who's my friend, and who's possibly my foe. The brain is receiving billions and billions of gigabytes of information, or bytes of information, all the time. And it's got to process this. So it's absolutely awe-inspiring when you consider the design of the brain. But let's face it, every bit of information your brain receives isn't a thought you have. Yeah? You can see that, right? Because you didn't think about the lighting until I mentioned it, unless something disturbed you. Right? So the brain's not just receiving this information, it's filtering this information. It's deciding, it's determining what category must this go into. Is this good? Is it bad? Is it right? Is it wrong? Am I safe? And it's filtering all this information by discerning patterns and norms. It's filtering this information by discerning it's filtering this information by discerning not just patterns and norms, but also what keeps you safe. When does it need to sound an internal alarm? So let's say you start to smell electric wires burning, and suddenly somebody at the back of the room, and especially if it's going to be Selwyn, shouts fire. You're going to run out of the room without needing to see the fire. Yes? So there's an internal alarm that's going to be sounded for you to take action. Some people may say, just hold on, I don't react to panic. Let me check it out first. And maybe they need to see a flame or two, right? But the bottom line is that this filtering system takes place. And the brain has a fantastic filter designed specifically for this, and it's called the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system finds those patterns, it finds those norms, it finds that information and puts it into the different boxes that it needs to put it in, so it's simpler for you to know what to respond to and how to respond. So now the question is, how does that then keep you safe? I want you to consider, in the case of the fire, what we're talking about is you're simply going to respond from a space of survival. You're simply going to do whatever's necessary to protect yourself. Similarly, if somebody should come in armed, heaven forbid, into the room, people will dive to the floor or they'll flood past through the exit at the back. We'd have an immediate response. The problem with this reticular activating system is that it simplifies things to such an extent that we develop an unavoidable human failing. And this unavoidable human failing is called subconscious bias. We cannot begin any conversation about diversity of any kind. Race, gender, religion, it doesn't matter what kind of diversity we're talking about. We can't enter the conversation without us confronting the reality that every single one of us, by virtue of our brains designed, are prone to a spectrum of bias. Bias translates to prejudice. Prejudice translates to all the other things we say we don't want. We don't want racism. We don't want sexism. We don't want homophobia. We don't want Islamophobia. And yet, the design of our brain leads us to this inevitable pitfall, a human condition. So now I'm going to share with you and take you down memory lane, because the reality is that as South Africans, our history has left us particularly biased, because memory and bias is entrenched in deep emotion. Have you ever realized that if I asked you about your childhood and I asked you to tell me your good memories, have you noticed that your good memories, your memories of your childhood are either very good or very bad? You don't remember ordinary days? We don't just remember the normal day when nothing happened. And there were hundreds of those. But we remember the horrible things and we remember the really good moments because they were emotionally charged. So as a nation, we have had so many traumatic experiences that the memory that we have related to that is extremely strong. We need to confront those things. We need to be willing to deal with ourselves around those issues before we can embark on conversations around diversity. And this is why I want to share with you a little bit about my own journey to awareness around my prejudice, around my bias, and how this awareness now informs the work I do with people and organizations. So I'm going to take the opportunity to share with you quite a personal experience. So I want you to imagine, as someone said to you, I'm no longer a young lady. I want you to imagine it's my first day of school. And this is somewhere in the 70s. And I'm going to school, and that's not really me, but it was something like that. And I'm going to school in the 70s. I did have an older brother at the same school. And in those days, we didn't have grade R where you first learned to read before you could go to school, right? In those days, you did your ABC, your abacus in sub A. So we're talking a while ago. So I want you to imagine this. I can't read anything yet, but I go home with a form. And I've got to tell my father and my mother. So bear with me. I go home and I hand my father a page. And I say to him, Daddy, my teacher said you need to sign this form. And you need to tell my teacher, am I white? Am I black? Am I colored or Indian? Or am I other? And I watch my father's face redden. And he shakes as he shouts at me. You tell your teacher, you belong to the human race and nothing else. And he storms out of the room. But as a 6-year-old, I felt like I did something wrong. Right? So I turned to my mother and I looked at her confused and she said, my darling, those aren't the ugly words we use. Those are not our words. And so began my resistance against the apartheid system. Now at that time I said to you, I couldn't read, but I learned to. I was at school and as I read, I raged. I learned to be impatient, to be able to get to high school, to be old enough to protest. to be old enough to attend student rallies, to be old enough to speak and have a voice and be heard. Because I was so clear that it was absolutely unjust, the regime under which we were living. But in that time, as I raged, I also witnessed terrible atrocities. I witnessed my teachers who wrote articles against the regime be silenced and imprisoned. I witnessed my cousin be arrested without detention, be detained without trial, be exiled in the end. And I noticed and witnessed my friends being shamboked at the rallies that we attended. I became ever more passionate to dismantle the system, and I became committed to a future, to a new South Africa, where my motto was to educate, to uplift, to empower. So I want you to not be re-traumatized, and I don't by any way claim that mine was the worst of experiences. I simply want you to understand the journey. In the commitment, when I finished high school, I studied a degree at UCT, at UWC, and I specialized in teaching English to speakers of other languages. Because I thought, somebody said language earlier on is a diversity issue. I thought maybe if we had a space to be able to build bridges, a way to be able to connect and understand each other across our communities, that maybe that was an answer. And so I spent many years in that domain. In that area, I worked in townships running language programs in Nyanga and Guguletu. I also ran programs with international visitors to our country, refugees and tourists alike. But in this field, I decided I want to take an opportunity to actually travel abroad, to get the opportunity to impact a part of the world where women are particularly oppressed. And so I wanted to take up a contract at the largest women's university in the world, in a part of the world where women's oppression is renowned, where women's liberties are so stifled. And I felt, very naively, that I'm going to be able to go there and make a difference. But in order to do this and to take the particular post, I needed to qualify as an international examiner. This was an exam, because of an international standard, where I needed to pass with 100%. Now, truth be told, as a high schooler, I was very much 80%er, and that cut it for my dad. My brother was the top student, today he's a professor. But yeah, I was okay doing all the other stuff. You can't toy and get straight A's, right? So the reality is that by the time I got to university, I dropped at least 20%. I was probably sitting on the 60%ers, right? So I knew, my God, 100%, this is going to be a stretch. But I put everything in it because there was the opportunity to have a completely different future, to have a dream be fulfilled, to impact something in another part of the world, to be able to engage another culture. And so I was extremely enthusiastic, despite the 100% deterrent pass mark. And I prepped for the trained, wrote the exam, and discovered via a very brief email that actually I had failed. I had surpassed my high school marks, I got 90%, and it just wasn't good enough. I had one opportunity to resit the exam. What it meant was that one of the 10 different people I had assessed, I had not assessed correctly. But which one? How would I know? So I prepped again, went to resit the exam, and I listened, and I listened, and I listened to each of these people. And I told myself, Hani, you can't mess this up. We've all got an inner critic, right? It kicks us when we're down. It tells you you're probably not going to make it. You might as well stuff it up further, right? And then because I couldn't have confidence, I said, at least you can have focus. Just focus. Look at the rubric. What's the rubric telling you to assess? And listen to the person speaking. And suddenly, as I listened to the 8th speaker, it wasn't the Brazilian, it wasn't the Chinese speaker, it wasn't the Italian, no matter how many A's he added to everything. As I listened to the 8th speaker, and I heard his flat Afrikaner accent, and him talking about rugby, I heard for the first time a voice in my head emphatically dismissing him as a dumb boer. And I was shocked. I had spent 15 years in education. I'd worked in multiple communities, in multiple cultures. I saw myself as somebody who was non-racist, championing the cause for a free, equitable, inclusive society. And here my own voice inside my head is listening to this man's accent, just his accent. And I reddened, even though I was just in a phone booth with headphones on, listening to this exam on a computer. I was humiliated to myself to catch out my bigotry. Now here's the truth of the matter. What I was responding to was not the person I was listening to. I was responding to the enemy of my angry youth. I was responding to every failure, every hurt, every missed opportunity due to the apartheid regime. In my world, this was the same thing. This young rugby player I was listening to might just as well have been P.V. Botha. Might just as well have been Verwoerd. Might just as well have been the constable who arrested my cousin. But here's the truth of the matter. He wasn't. He wasn't the person who shampoked us. He wasn't the Afrikaner who caused that my cousin was exiled and I never got to see her again. She died in Sweden at the age of 24. Many people say she died of grief and isolation. Here's the thing that I had to come to terms with. For the first time, I was facing my own bias. For the first time, because I could get that, I could listen to this man in that moment switch and hear, what is he saying? Who is he? And when I did that, something very interesting happened. I heard here's a young man being interviewed in an international exam so that he can create a new future in New Zealand as a young rugby player on a scholarship. But he was busy creating a future just like me. I started to realize that he was sitting an exam just like me. I started to realize that he was facing a new experience, a new opportunity. He was creating new opportunities for himself just like me. He was probably afraid of failing, just like me. And when I realized that he belonged to the human race, just like me, there was something else I could hear. I could hear the possibility of our shared humanity. I could hear the possibility of opportunities really happening. But my past said that he was a threat to me. My past said that he was the enemy. And had I listened to my past, I would have sabotaged his future and mine. I would not have given him permission. I would not have said he met the criteria to go abroad. With that language level at least. So I'm grateful for that realization. The possibility didn't just give me an opportunity to get beyond our differences, but an opportunity to acknowledge our shared humanity. And I really want you to hold that phrase, our shared humanity. So my training as a coach helped me to identify my bias. But I want you to get that was only the second time round and only because I failed. Had I not failed, I would not have re-looked that conversation. It didn't register for me the first time it was there. It only registered because I was looking, where did I fail? Because I was asking a different question. But now I want you to imagine something else. Of course, I passed, he passed. I managed to get the academic post in the Middle East. And I had loads of lessons. It was a good experience, a priming experience for all the culture clashes I was to live over there. And lots of learning was about to take place. But I want you to imagine something else. Imagine it wasn't an exam. Imagine It was someone I was working with daily. And I was as dismissive subconsciously whenever they spoke. I want you to imagine if I disregarded him because I already believed we were just too different. I want you to imagine if I had used all my historic evidence to prove that I was right, because who would blame me? Right? Surely, with everything we've lived through, we're right to have the views we have of each other. And that's where we get stuck. We use the evidence to keep ourselves right. But what kind of work environment would I have created? What kind of culture would exist around me? And what are the chances that we'd ever be in a culture of connection? That we'd ever be in a society of inclusion? Or live in a community of fair and shared contribution? So now I'm going to switch tracks. What's your bias? Now, it's easy, and actually it's not so easy for me to share that story with you, right? But that's where it starts, right? For you to look and to see, hold on, what's the truth I need to tell myself about myself? And here's an easy place to look. Who are the people who irritate you? Yeah, they loads. And I'm sure they're a diverse group. There's not just one type that irritates you, right? But that's a good place to look. Who are the people that you know you tune out when they speak? These are the questions we need to be asking. Who do you see as other? You mentioned that early answer, the othering that we do. But we do it to ourselves as well. I'm often in environments where I'm the only Muslim and then I feel excluded, or I feel too different. It's the othering of myself. Yes? And so we do that, and then we look for evidence around us. People can say the smallest thing or look skew in the smallest way, and then that's proof that they've othered us. We haven't othered ourselves. Would you dismiss as irrelevant? And whose otherness do you see as a problem? You know how we all think, you know who should be in this talk now? That person. No, that's not the person. It's you. You're the one who was divinely selected to be here. So you're the one who needs to be looking inward. And somebody said that to me earlier on. Doesn't it start with looking inward? Of course it does. So we need to, as I said, only look at the horrors of the last few weeks to notice that we are not embracing diversity. Not at all. We talk about it, we might chant together about it, but that doesn't mean we're actually transcending our differences. And it doesn't mean we're actually willing to step inside of a circle called our shared humanity. That's not necessarily what we're doing. So what if we were seeking out our commonalities instead? Commonalities was a word that came up earlier. Similarities, commonalities. And that's where the children's book, Just Like Me, comes in. Just Like Me is all about saying, from a child's point of view, and here's the magic and why we need to all find our inner child. Because children don't see the differences in the ways that we do. Not at all. The things they pick up as different are nowhere near the things that you pick up as different. So, amongst the things, this is just one of the pages out of the book, where Raha says that she's talking about a party and she wants to have Zarina there who wants to be a ballerina just like her. And here's the interesting thing. Raha doesn't see it as impossible, and neither does Zarina. But some of us do. Some of us look at our differences and we make them limitations. So what if we uncovered those similarities? So I like to refer to this as the Just Like Me effect, and the starting point for transcending diversity or embracing diversity. Finding common ground. So in other words, when you lean in together, and I'd like you to try this now for 2 minutes in your groups. I'd like you to lean in together and find with each person something you have in common that you didn't know. It can't be the obvious things like, you're in this group, you're all women, I can see that. You actually need to talk about it and discover something you didn't know you have in common. And this is why it's a good reason to have listened to Selwyn early on and not sit with people you already know. So something you don't know you have in common with each other. You've got an opportunity to just chat to each other, and I'll give you a few minutes. A lot of laughing happening. Hoping it's good things you found you have in common. But I'm wondering. So let's hear. Who would like to share? Yes, over here.
We found out that we're all parents and all got daughters.
All parents and parents of daughters. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. That must make for last week have been a very scary week. Thank you. Anybody else? What you discovered you have in common?
We all like to walk.
You all like walking. Okay.
We are leaders. We are parents. And we love learning.
Your parents, you are leaders and lifelong learners. Okay, fantastic. Yes?
We discovered we love music.
You all love music, but not the same type of music. Music in general. Find the common ground. That's the key. Thank you. So here's the thing. The minute we've got common ground, there's an entry point for the conversation. There's a starting point for being equals. There's a space where we can exercise compassion. There's a space from which we can actually stand in that expression I asked you to remember, our shared humanity. So here's the thing. In education, obviously, it's fundamental that we work in communities. As people connected to Partners for Possibility, we know this. It's only through community that we can co-create inclusion. But if I put that differently, if I flip that on its head, I could ask you a few different questions. So I really want you to reflect on this as I ask you. What type of principal, what type of school principal annoys you? You got an answer over there? You want to jump up and shout about it? No, she's rather going to keep it to herself. Okay. But yes, you all have an idea that came to mind. What type of educator don't you want to work with? It's like, please don't partner me with that one. We all have someone. Definitely. Another area of our shared humanity. What type of learner do you dread is going to enter your class? And what type of learner do you love having in your class? Now you want to notice in all of your reactions, they tell us a lot more about you than about the other person. And this talk is about us expanding our self-awareness in order to engage more powerfully in the work of embracing diversity. We can't do it out there unless we've tackled our own demons. And our demons include our intolerances. This is really at the crux of the matter. The answers tell us about ourselves. So the next level of questions will be, we'll get there. So in this self-awareness, we can engage various stakeholders, but we can engage them from a place of compassion. Because if you've identified your intolerance, aren't you going to be a little bit more compassionate when you're dealing with somebody else's intolerance? Seeing that we identified that we are all, by the nature of being human, biased, prejudiced, none of us are immune. So let's stop talking about this issue like it's somebody else's problem, or like someone else doesn't get it yet. It's actually each of us, and it's a lifelong task of developing self-awareness. You can't say that, I know myself and now it's done. We're constantly changing. We're constantly dealing with new crises. Our daughters are growing, and with every age, our sons and our daughters engage, we have to be a new kind of parent. You can't be the same parent you were 3 years ago. So you can't say you know yourself. You haven't yet discovered yourself. And that's where we need to stand. So if we stand in not having yet discovered ourselves, we can start to co-create for a culture of connection by asking about how do we discover our shared values? because our shared values can become the compass. It can become the guiding light we need for how to navigate this. Now, don't write it off and say, but we definitely have different values. Discover is the key word, not shared. Discover. So what do we need in order to be in discovery mode? In order to be lifelong learners, what do we need? And these are the 4 practices that I advocate in the programs and that we often design our workshops around. Practices for co-creating a culture of connection. I round them up as the 4 C's. They're the practice of caring. Who would have thought it's as simple as caring? Courage, curiosity, and then candor. Now, what do we mean by caring, courage, curiosity, and candor? Well, firstly, what's important to get about caring is we've got to care enough about the end goals to start taking different actions. We can't wait for crisis upon crisis to hit before we recognize we need to take different actions. We need to care about the way in which we engage people, not just that we engage. What's the manner in which we engage? We need to care that each learner, each educator, each parent experiences that their voice matters, that they experience that they matter, that their experience at your school matters, that they are safe and that they belong. We need to care about that, not as a slogan, as a way of being, as a way of engaging. Caring for the way that we leave people at the end of a conversation, and people, a staff meeting is a conversation. How we leave people at the end of a conversation matters. We need to care enough for the bully. Now that may be a tough one because we like to see bullies as the problem, isn't it? The bully isn't the problem. Bullying is a problem. But can we care enough about the bully? And what does it mean to care about the bully? What does it mean to care about the parent who never attends meetings? What does it mean to care about the learner who's smoking dacha in the back of the school grounds? And then the next one I'd like to talk about is candor. Even though it's last on the slide, what do I mean by candor? What do you understand by candor? Being honest, truth-telling. My grandmother used to say, straight talk is no insult. Have you heard that expression? Straight talk is no insult. But here's the interesting thing. We must practice candor with ourselves first. In other words, we must learn to talk straight to ourselves about ourselves. And unfortunately, this is lacking mostly in our society and definitely in leadership. So in other words, it doesn't work for me to come and talk to you about bias unless I address my own bias, unless I recognize my own blind spots. So now when I can tell you the truth about my blind spots, you're clear I'm not standing here somebody better than you, telling you how to deal with diversity because, hello, I'm immune. That's ridiculous. So similarly in our school grounds, in our school communities, we can't speak as if we are flawless and perfect. We need to have candor to tell the truth about our own weaknesses, our own challenges, our own struggles. We can't shy away from that. But it also means that we need to pair candor with caring. So you don't say straight talk is no insult and then you insult someone and say, hey, I'm just being straight. And so agrees with me, you are like that. Right? That's what we tend to do. And then we call it candor. No, you've got to pair. So these 4 come together. You've got to pair caring with candor. So if we care, we will choose how we do straight talk and how we leave people feeling after we have shared truthfully what's so, what's the reality. We must be candid enough to call out injustice, to call out oppression, to call out toxic masculinity when we see it. But we must also own our role. And I'm sure as mothers, many of us have been sitting with, what has been our role in raising boys who practice toxic masculinity? And if we don't ask this question as women, as mothers, we are not caring enough. And we are not candid enough. So candor becomes an expression of caring. We can't pretend to cover up what doesn't work. When we embrace diversity, we're also not using diversity as an excuse or a cover for poor performance. So we need to be mindful on so many different levels. How are we practicing candor, and how are we pairing that with caring? And then I said courage. Now why courage? Well, firstly, it takes courage to be candid with yourself about yourself. And not many people want to go there. Right? Staring naked at yourself in the mirror and identifying all your warts and all your roles is not an easy thing to do. Most people prefer the lights to be off. Am I right? Yes, definitely. So it takes courage, doesn't it, to really look ourselves in the eye and to say, I am part of the problem. What am I going to do about it? What part do I own? You see, if we don't apply courage because we stick to what's familiar. What's familiar is easy, isn't it? We resort to the same reactions in most situations, the same punishments, the same discipline, not because it works, but because it's familiar. It's what we've always done. It's how we do it here, isn't it? And then we call it our rules and regulations, our policies and procedures, and we make it sound nice. When we're just really too lazy to exercise courage, or maybe too fearful. Because to tread the unfamiliar path is scary. To be the first one to initiate that something must change is scary. To be a lone voice for transformation is scary. So it takes courage to sit down with a bully and to ask, what's hurting you? And how often is that our approach to bullying? What do you need from us as support? And then to shut up and really listen. That takes courage. And then to care enough to be authentic in our response. Especially in the stand against gender violence. Caring for our boys must play a role. We need to ask ourselves, what are we putting in place to create programs for positive masculinity? We can't just chant toxic masculinity. We need to provide alternatives. Who are we rallying to be role models? Who are we rallying to mentor our boys? If we accept the realities that too many of our boys don't have those role models. And this is not sidelining the issues of our girls by any means, but we can't solve only part of the problem. So to embrace diversity and to invite inclusion, courage is essential. And then the last one is curiosity. Now, why do I say curiosity? I spoke to you about being willing to be in discovery mode. Now, one of the types of biases that we can face, and there are a myriad of types of biases, right? If somebody agrees with you, that's confirmation bias. Can you see everybody says so? He is the naughty one. And so that's confirmation bias, but it's a bias. But curiosity is the antithesis of knowledge and certainty. So if you're here because you want to know something, you're in the wrong room. This is not about letting you know something, but it is about encouraging you, urging you, and inviting you to start asking different questions. Instead of asking questions about who's right and who's wrong, who was the good one, who was the bad one, who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, who's the villain. Instead of asking those kinds of questions, we can start asking discovery questions. And discovery questions should be aimed at ourselves first. So let's try a few of them. What's my current view of the Department of Education? How does this view serve our shared goals? Does it help us to partner, or does it leave me protecting my turf? How do I view the parents of our learners? Which of our shared concerns, parents and educators, and which of our shared commitments am I holding present when I engage those parents? Or am I simply standing in what I want from them and wanting them to understand what they're not doing, what they need to do more of, what they're not doing enough of, or just how difficult their child is? Now, if I were not attached to this point of view, if I were willing to step outside of my point of view, if I were willing to give it up for a moment, not completely, what would I do differently? If I were to ask different parents, different questions about the parents, or different questions about the department, or different questions about our school leaders, or our community leaders, what would I do differently? What's my perception of community leaders? Do I see them as allies, or do I see them as enemies? Now, in gang-ridden communities, let's face it, the gangs are community leaders. They are rounding up people and getting a following, probably faster than you. It's an easy answer to say they are the enemy. What would be different questions we could ask? You see, when we exercise curiosity, we're inviting ourselves to see the situation newly. In one of the courses I took when I studied at Stellenbosch, we had to write a paper on what would an alien say about. And it was a long essay. And it was about an interaction, a communication interaction. What would an alien say? Now, the minute you try to put yourself in the mindset of an alien, and you've never met one, at the minute you try to do that, you're standing far enough back from how we operate to actually be a little bit objective. To not stand in your point of view, to say, if it were weird, what would people be doing? So if an alien were looking at us now, what would they be saying? What's going on in that room? Ideas. Pop, pop, pop. No? Again.
Again, the conversation of valuing diversity.
Again, the conversation of valuing diversity. Okay, would the aliens see that? Okay, aliens have been watching us for so long, they know we're going around in circles. Here's the interesting, yes? Possibly. Right. Okay, so consider you're still thinking like a human. And until we practice this and play and get like the weirdest answer, you'll know you're stepping outside of what you already know. And that's what the invitation of curiosity is. Are we willing to stand and look at the situation like we don't know? Not like it's again, but are we willing to look at it like we actually don't know? Inviting inclusion is very much about being willing to hear other points of views, experiences, ways of expression, articulations of similar ideas. But it's also very much about listening to our shared fears, our shared concerns, our shared hopes and aspirations and dreams. And if we don't create spaces in our schools where we can share those things that make us human, we won't get to connect. So while embracing diversity, embracing diversity is very much about being willing to hear these, it is very much about our differences, inviting inclusion is about the willingness to hear the concerns and aspirations. While embracing diversity is about recognizing and actively, consciously overriding our bias. So if there's a certain type of woman who annoys you, get to know such a woman. Go and sit with her and ask permission to have a conversation and get to know her. If there's a certain type of leader who irritates you, go and book some time with them and get to know them as a human being. That's what's needed. We keep each other in our boxes, but you don't want to be boxed. I certainly don't. Inviting inclusion is about asking different questions and showing a willingness to truly listen. And in the process, we'll discover gifts beyond our imagination. We'll grow a sense of sameness and connection that heals all of us. We don't have to be the same, but we do need to figure out, how are we the same? Where are we the same? Embracing diversity is an invitation. It's an invitation to shift from your head, from all the stuff you know, from all the thinking, into your heart, where there's space for caring and compassion. It's an invitation to shift from being closed off and protective to being open, to being willing. To shift from knowing to being curious, from fear to courage, and from certainty to discovery. Because only together, in conversations where we're willing to listen, can we have an inclusive society where you experience love and belonging. Thank you so much for your attention.